It's a season of fire, of harsh winter, of chaos and cruelty. The fires are ferocious and hungry, winters severe, earthquakes angry. Cruelty is so tangible that each one must seek out stability and equilibrium, finding it harder to attain that space alone, seeking rather for healing togetherness. We thought we knew fire and winter and earthquakes, finding suddenly that our understanding is antiquated, cracked, brittle. In fact, it has crumbled. What threatens equilibrium further is the reality that we, as people of this nation, no longer speak the same language. Not about what we're seeing, feeling, or experiencing, leading us to doubt our perception, our position, our promise. We find ourselves in a place we thought we knew. We mistook it for a place we've been before, but struggle with the fury and rage of unknown reality. Everything seems different now, unknown, causing us to shrink back in terror or lash out in aggression, both precursors of hopelessness. Things are different now. Even as we hear people shush our collective growing discontent with the assurance that we have been here before. Dr. Jamar Tisby, professor, historian, and best-selling author, clarifies that those who repeat the line, "We've been here before," do so with the intent to reassure people that we have seen bad actors in political office before. We have faced injustice and repression. We survived then, and we can survive now. While agreeing that there is some continuity between the past and the present, Tisby points to the field of sports as an analogy. To say we've been here before implies that we can take last year's winning strategies, replicate the plays without giving any thought to the fact that there are now new coaches, different players, altered game plans, and updates in or dismantling of facilities and equipment. In the text from Matthew, which Lisa read, Jesus, too, points to fundamental differences between how his hearers thought things were and how they actually were at the time of hearing. Jesus reframes a well-known concept for his hearers who thought they were spiritually literate. Turns out they may have only been religiously literate, and there is a difference. In this text, Jesus calls his hearers to shift their perception. He points to what he calls an ancient command, which everyone around him would have known, and essentially he says, "You know it's wrong to murder, don't you? Well, let me tell you. The underlying reality of murder is defined much more broadly than you think. If you think you're squeaky clean simply because you have never caused the physical death of another human being, think again. Your rage toward another person, your language of contempt against someone is equal to the act of murder." Jesus has just recalibrated perception. He has shifted the season. What his hearers understood as murder is suddenly an earthquake of much greater magnitude, a ferocious fire that is more than anyone would have ever thought. And around this seed we call murder, there is a bewildering web of vices, rudeness, thoughtlessness, rage, explosive language, grudges, animosity, revenge, criminality. Who would have ever thought that the core of all these common actions and experiences is equal to murder? Jesus had just blown that season wide open. Now their preparedness is in question. Suddenly they realize they have not been there before. They can't extinguish the fire with conventional methods, so to speak. They will have to construct buildings much differently, able to withstand vicious earthquakes. They'll need to layer on clothing and insulation to prevent themselves from the harshness of winter overcoming them. Jesus doesn't leave his hearers or us without resources in this new season of fires, of earthquakes, and of harsh winters. He offers tools that are designed with precision, tools to navigate high winds to deliver greater capacity of water into the flames. He speaks of mitigating the widening cracks which form the earth's shifting. He brings a warmth which can melt the ice of the harshest climate. Here's how he elaborates on the perception shift. If you remember a friend who has a grudge against you, reach out. Don't wait for them to take a move. You approach them. Offer a reconciling hand despite your own sense of innocence. Counterintuitive? Yes. But we're in a new season of fire. It's more important to be reunited with a friend who has become a thorn in our side than to keep up religious or moral or progressive pretenses. Leave that offering on the altar, so to speak, and find your friend. Leave that social media post unfinished. Leave that protest before it even gets to City Hall. Leave that donation for reconstruction of destroyed buildings for another time. Find your friend. Unconventional? I'd say so. But we're in a season of harsh winters. And while you're at it, Jesus essentially says, if you're out and about and someone shouts at you, or is obnoxious in traffic, or obviously comports themselves in a way that you find reprehensible, avoid the immediate urge to respond in kind. Your chance of winning this skirmish is slim. Don't end up in a place that you'll regret. I challenge you to reread that text. It's in the QR code in your bulletin, and compare these scenarios. Let these same guidelines function as parameters for your online discourses as well. Instead of meeting incoming contempt in kind, meet it with equal portions of grace and compassion. Sound naive? Yeah, possibly. But we have not been here before. We're in a season of chaos and cruelty. We have also become unclear of our position as people of this nation, as concerned global citizens, and as Jesus followers. We may think we know exactly what our position is and able to articulate it very clearly. But look more closely. Is your position articulated in opposition to someone else's? Is it repeating someone else's words? Or is it truly your own position? And based on what? Historian and Yale professor Dr. Timothy Snyder has written a succinct little book entitled On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. Lesson 9 is be kind to our language. And in the summary statement that begins this chapter, this is what he writes. Avoid pronouncing the phrase everyone else does. Think up your own way of speaking, even if only to convey the thing you think everyone is saying. Make an effort to separate yourself from the internet. Read books. Those are his words. This book is available where you purchase books. It's also available in multiple formats at your local library, and I have to say it comes in an amazing graphic novel format, so take advantage of it. It's a must-read for everyone. In order to successfully recalibrate our position, we will need to be vigilant about language. Sharing social media posts just like that? Questionable. Can you take the gist of the statement that resonates with you and craft it in your own words? This one exercise will shape your position tremendously. It is a discipline. It will require you to think deeply about what it is that you agree with or how you would articulate your disagreement. I've heard parents tell their children, use your words instead of throwing a tantrum. Well, it's time that we use our words. This exercise will also slow down our responses, causing us to think carefully about what truly is worthy of our time. Not every sentiment, not every clever meme, not even every act of chaos and cruelty that we observe needs to be validated by our engagement. Be discerning. Suddenly we realize we've not been here before. We can't extinguish the fire with conventional methods. We will have to construct buildings much differently to withstand more vicious earthquakes. We'll need new layers of clothing and insulation to protect us from the frostbite of the harsh winters. On January 28th, NPR's podcast 1A aired an interview between the host Jen White and her guest Bishop Marianne Edgar Buddy. They spoke together about faith and politics. The host was pointed in her questions, giving Bishop the opportunity to deepen the hearer's understanding of the faith that guides her. Her comments touched on both action and language. Contemptuous language, she said, has become normalized and expected, but it's dangerous. She spoke of the Dignity Index. Have you ever heard of that before? The Dignity Index, a scale that looks at different forms of speech and measures them in terms of contempt and dignity. This is an actual tool that you can find with an internet search. The bishop, in her calm and compelling voice, called for honoring and preserving the dignity of every human being, especially standing up for those who are not being treated respectfully or given dignity. She made the point clearly that we need not argue with someone in order to underscore their fundamental right to be treated with dignity, and we don't need to agree with them either. Affirming dignity does not mean agreement. Affirming dignity is not condoning behavior. Affirming dignity is a response to Creator's decision to place the divine image inside of each human being. When confronting someone who threatens social order and freedom, the bishop invites us to focus on behavior and not make assumptions and statements about character or worth. In other words, keep speech on subject matter rather than on the dignity, or the perceived lack of it, of people. She calls us to find the way to communicate person to person, if that's possible, and always to avoid violence in language. There are two practices that she spoke of. She spoke of humor, specifically satire. She affirmed that humor in general, and definitely satire, is important, especially when one feels little control. However, humor at the expense of another is never a responsible option. Second, she spoke about the word hate. She has chosen not to use that word, and this has become one of her spiritual practices. This is another example of being kind to language, and in so doing to strengthen our integrity and our credibility. This is a recalibration and a thoughtful articulation of our position. This is a kind of resiliency we need. This is part of our response to the new season of fires, earthquakes, and harsh winters in our culture. It seems to me that Jesus' followers that we considered in Matthew had an advantage over us. After a revolutionary statement like the one that Jesus made, they could just carry on walking with him over the dusty hillsides, and they could think about it, they could ask clarifying questions, and they could try to figure out what in the world does he mean and what does it mean for me today. So how about we try something similar? Take, for instance, a season of fire, a time of searing anguish, anxiety, dread, and a sense of defeat. What could be our spiritual antidote during this time? During this season, we can reach for the cool springs of remembrance. The Psalms offer a reflection of what we experience. Go back to the Psalms. For example, Psalm 14 verses 5 and 6, also in the Message paraphrase, reads like this: God takes the side of the victims. Do you think you can mess with the dreams of poor people? You can't, for God makes their dreams come true. End quote. If this feels out of step with what we're seeing today, remember the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The arc of the moral universe is long, and it bends toward justice. This psalm and others, and the words of wise leaders, become these cooling springs of remembrance. But what about the harsh winters of cruel words and heinous action? What is our spiritual antidote? I believe it comes directly out of the 6th chapter of the book of Micah. Act justly, love mercy, walk humbly with God. This is the compassion and mercy that Bishop Buddy lived out and spoke to the president, to all elected officials, to the nation, to us, and indeed to the entire world. Act justly, love mercy, walk humbly with God in everyday circumstances. And how do we navigate the unstable times of national and international earthquakes? These seismic shifts are felt on a daily basis now, with recurring, ongoing tremors many times daily. We feel these earthquakes exemplified in hubris on display in every level and branch of government. And it seeps into local government as well. And let's watch it that it doesn't seep into our families, into our church life, and into our neighborhoods. This hubris spreads like a virus, infecting people who are not vigilant or awake. This arrogance, this short-sighted self-absorption represents an attack on the very essence of creation. Recognize it for what it is. How do we find our spiritual antidote, even as we tend to the wounds that we have suffered? We do this with humility, recognizing our vulnerability, our sense of helplessness, our fear. But we also lean into a humility that pushes us to take our rightful place as healers, not destroyers, reconcilers, not alienators. In this, we are not helpless. In this, we find our strength, a strength that will equal our days, as uttered in a prayer in Deuteronomy 33, verse 25. This is our promise. This is what we are here for today, tomorrow. Humility is our posture. Healing is our mission. It's a season of fire, of harsh winter, of chaos and cruelty. It's also a season of generative, abundant, glorious hope. It's a season of generative hope because we will rise to be who we are. It's a season of abundant hope because our strength, the deliberate practicing of our spiritual faith, will ignite others to this same abundant hope. It is a season of glorious hope because we will participate in this season as healers and helpers and artists, composers, writers, poets, builders, gardeners, entrepreneurs, students, activists, comforters, and those who learn the absolute necessity of defiant rest. It will not be enough to think we are spiritually literate, when in reality we may only be religiously literate. We will cash in the notion that we've been here before for the mantle to live in this season that we've not been in before. May God help us.